Good afternoon. I'm Nor Kokiar, the Executive Director of the Washington State China Relations Council. Our organization was founded in 1979 to develop and improve bilateral relations between the US and China. Among our activities, we strive to explore and publicize areas where the US and China should and do collaborate for the creation of public goods. Today's webinar, presented while the world still suffers through its largest pandemic in over 100 years, examines one area where the world's two largest economies need to be working together to solve global health problems. Today, we have an excellent panel and moderator to help us understand where the two countries are collaborating, areas of potential cooperation, and roadblocks that might get in the way. Our panelists today include Steve Davis, who's the Senior Advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and formerly the CEO of PATH, Jennifer Bowie, a Senior Policy Researcher and Epidemiologist at the RAND Corporation, and Jeff Hall, Deputy Director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our panelist and moderator all have extensive experience working with China. Our moderator today is Christy Heim, who's the Director of Corporate Communications for IMAB Biopharma. Before joining the healthcare industry, Christy actually served in the job I have now as the Executive Director of the Washington State China Relations Council for the years 2014 to 2016. Prior to her council role, Christy spent approximately 15 years as a journalist writing about business, technology, and global health for publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the Seattle Times. Christy completed her BA in journalism and holds a master's degree in international relations with a focus on China from the University of Washington. And before I turn the program over to Christy, I'd like to remind our participants to please keep themselves on mute throughout the program. We have allotted time for audience Q&A, and we'll try our best to get to all your questions near the end of the program. Lastly, the session is being recorded, and details on how to access it will be available on our website, the Washington State China Relations Council website, and our sister organization's website, the Washington State China Relations Fund. So without further ado, Christy, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nor. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Lunar New Year. Appreciate the introduction, and also thank you to the Washington State China Relations Council for organizing this event. We have three highly accomplished panelists today, each covering a different angle on China, global health, and the US-China relationship. I'll ask them to introduce themselves shortly. For the audience, I just want to frame the discussion a bit as we hope to cover the current conditions for healthcare collaboration, both by governments and also by companies and organizations, the evolving strategic competition and soft power, and the global health outlook. So we will leave time for questions from the audience at the end, so please make your submissions through the chat box. For the panelists, I'll direct questions to specific people to start off, but please jump in with any comments anytime. So I'll now ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Jennifer, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. My name is Jennifer Bowie. I grew up in Beijing from a physician family, and I was early on trained as a physician in cardiologist in Beijing. But I chose to study public health in the US and so stayed. So I have been a faculty at the Department of International Health at Georgetown University for 17 years. And right now I'm serve as the department chair. About 3 years ago, I joined the RAND Corporation as the town chair for China Policy Studies in the Center for Asian Pacific Policies. So in this position, I focused on a couple of things I focused on. One is the US-China dialogues that we managed to focus on a couple of topics. One, we just wrapped up a green energy report. This is between RAND and the Energy Foundation of China. And then we're starting a trade report with a partner with the Tsinghua University. I also conduct research on global health and soft power, gender equity in Asia, and have worked on multiple BRI related projects. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I provided several testimony to the congressional committees on the modernization of the surveillance system, as well as the healthcare and public health system in China. And recently, I focused more on the data issues and partnering with Yale Law School, as well as the China's Academy of Social Science, try to find legal ways to continue to share data across countries and to see what policy can facilitate that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, hello everybody, and it's great to be here again, as always. I have been around the China Relations Council for decades, so it's great to be back. I'm currently an advisor to the Gates Foundation on many things, but more recently I've served as the interim director of their China office, and so I've been quite involved in all things COVID and all things other things we do in China, including ag and wash and other work we can describe. But I also am a faculty at Stanford in the innovation at Stanford Business School and advise the World Economic Forum and others. I have a long history, like many do, in China, in and about China, early days over there in the 70s and 80s, studied at Beida, did my law degree there, been in and out for a variety of reasons. But I'm happy to be here today and share what I can tell you about the global health and development relationships we have with Chinese partners. Thanks.
Great. Jeff?
Thanks, Christy. Hi, everyone. Great to be here as well. I also work at the Gates Foundation. I am the Deputy Director for Strategy, Planning, and Management with the China office. So I have spent the last couple of years working very closely with Steve. I manage a suite of things related to both our programmatic strategies and execution of our grant-making portfolio, as well as our internal operations and navigating a lot of the complexities that we'll talk about today in terms of our operations and policy changes and things like that. So I have a team of folks that manages all of those issues. Prior to the China office, I worked in the policy and advocacy space within our North American office, focusing on US and China policy. Excuse me, US and Canada policy. So I've been with the foundation for about 7 years. And prior to that, I had a number of different roles in domestic and global consulting. So again, happy to be with you today and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you all very much. So for the first question, some of the audience may remember we were at the US-China Series Conference in Seattle talking about this topic in January 2020, the same day as a Washington State resident returned from Wuhan and would be the first confirmed US case of COVID-19. Earlier that year, the CDC had been scaling back staff in China, including the epidemiologist who was embedded in China's CDC. So now we've been fighting against COVID for 2 years. So my question is, how have the US and China been interacting recently to combat COVID? What has worked and what hasn't? Maybe start with Jennifer?
Great, thank you, Christy. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I remember that when I came to that meeting, I came back from Beijing too, and we're just talking about that first case. So 2 years, about 2 years now. So as you said, US and China, especially CDC global health collaboration has a long history, especially heightened after the 2003 SARS. So I think the peak might be around 2014 to 2016 when both countries work in the West Africa on Ebola. And after that, they made the agreement to build Africa CDC. So that was, I think, the pinnacle of their collaboration. But since then, it definitely has, we see the NSF office have closed, GAP office closed, CDC staff have dropped from 47 to, I think, right before COVID-19 was about 14 staff. So we did see this decline, and COVID-19 didn't help. All right, so politically, I think the two countries going even further. The origin of the pandemic, China's vaccine and mask diplomacy, China's lockdown and zero policy on COVID, misinformation. So all of these become barriers for the two countries. In addition to that, I think the China initiative that, for a while targeting the Chinese ethnic scientists or, people work with China, that also spill over to the academic and have some chilling effects. And then the travel ban, the difficulty, the paranoia about the pandemic. So there's not a lot going on. Although I do see in the last year, there seems to be some slow recovery. We know that the CDC office in Beijing now, US CDC office in Beijing now have increased the staff. Now they have 17 staff with 2 more US-based staff and a new director. And we have seen that some of the dialogues on global health is starting slowly coming back after 2 years of stop. But in terms of COVID efforts, I think each country has very different policy. As we can see, there's not easy to compare. Although I was asked by a reporter last week to give a score, I said it's not that easy to score that. But then in terms of other countries in global health assistance, I think each country are doing their own. Although I see that China definitely has scaled up its efforts, its unprecedented amount of support to many countries, as well as clinical trials with many other countries. So that I think is the first time for China. And then U.S. policy seems to be, in a way, is counter China, counter China's efforts or influence in this field. So we definitely hope to see more come around, more collaborations, but it's not the same as a few years ago.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jeff or Steve, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I think Jennifer described it well, that it's a very different era than it was just 5 years ago. And there's so many underlying currents around that. I mean, whether it's sort of encroaching US-China policy, which is very, it's like one of the few bipartisan agendas that is viable in DC anymore. I think we counted yesterday, there's about 300 anti-Chinese legislations in front of the U.S. Congress. Most of them won't pass, but nonetheless, there's that. But also, there's a very much a changing domestic environment in China, and that's also contributing a lot to this. So it's many dimensions. A couple of things I'd add. One is the story's not over, for sure. And in fact, if anything, we're all sort of watching carefully right now. In fact, through the Olympics, but also how Omicron emerges or doesn't emerge in China, and not having the full toolkit to fight it because of the vaccine, inactivated vaccines that China has used is less effective. And so watching that play out will be very important, and it has a whole bunch of political, implications one way or the other. And then of course the global effort, which is something that we're very involved in as a foundation, in terms of securing support, et cetera. We have a lot more work to do, and there are some interesting examples of, if not full on old school partnerships, at least good collaborations, at least knowing what China's doing this and we'll do that, et cetera. I want to just add one thing, though. I don't think, and maybe this will be the core of our content going forward, but there are exceptions, and sometimes the exceptions, prove the rule. And while I would say for sure the era of global health being a safe harbor where, lots of things could get done sort of regardless of the political issues, that's no longer true. COVID, the WHO, the sort of lab origins issues. There's just layers and layers. While that's not always true. That said, if you talk to, I used to chair the Fred Hutch. I know from the Gates Foundation's point of view, there are lots and lots of individual collaborations still. And in pharma, we can talk about that. In you know, a lot of tech transfer still happening. We have a very robust portfolio of activity across our agenda in China. And while we've seen some chilling effect, it hasn't actually impeded progress on any major program we've had, including vaccine development support in China. And, you know, we see the global health research community continuing to find ways to engage, not as easily as before, and certainly, you know, always now with more oversight and more sort of obstacles to manage, but it's still happening. So I don't want to paint a completely dire picture that nothing's happening today.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to pick up on one of the points. Jeff, if you have a comment, please.
No, go right ahead.
Okay. One of the comments that Steve was making, of course, you know, beyond the two governments, there are multiple layers to this relationship, including the private sector, scientific research, civil society. I mean, we know, for example, that global pharmaceutical companies are tapping into China's rapidly expanding biotech sector to develop products or license things. A local company, Seagen, recently signed a $2.6 billion deal with Remgene of China to develop a novel cancer drug. And we've heard of some interesting new efforts, such as the Bloomberg International Cancer Coalition that Kevin Rudd co-chairs. So how are these kinds of collaborations faring, Steve?
Yeah, well, picking up on my last comment, I mean, they are happening, and they are continuing to happen. And I think, you know, a lot of early stage waiting to, you know, the cancer one is an early collaboration, but we're continuing to move forward in a number. I mean, I see, you know, both what ones that the foundation is involved in, but other commercial, we see a lot of those. I think there are a couple of qualifications. One, and, you know, maybe this is something Jeff can speak to on our part, but one, the level of oversight and as a foreign, you know, JV or a foreign party, foreign company, the rules of the road are changing. And so while the business is still happening and the partnerships, there's a lot of operational new challenges, both in terms of, you know, we are the largest, the Gates Foundation is the largest foreign NGO operating in China. And while we arguably have sort of a special relationship because of Bill's relationship to Xi Jinping and others, we still have a lot of bureaucratic layers to work through on everything we do, and a lot of oversight. And I would say that's a similar experience for a lot of commercial partners that we have, US-based commercial partners and collaborations. That said, you know, there are some things in China that are happening that end up being almost a positive, you know, sort of netting out, like, okay, I mean, new policies that coming out of COVID, we've seen the Chinese State Council and you know, be very clear that they weren't happy with some of the ways that, you know, they're not going to be too public about it, but the way that you know, the Chinese vaccines didn't get through the regulatory process in an expeditious way. And so that's putting a new spotlight for us on how to help support getting that regulatory standard, the NMPA, to a higher level. There's, of course, there's the Common Prosperity Agenda, which is a new, you know, which may or may not, there's all sorts of interpretations, how bearish or bullish you look at it in terms of its effect on markets and entrepreneurs, but it also speaks to, you know, building more equity in society and building more philanthropy. So we're already seeing some of the tech and pharma companies being more philanthropic and putting more things toward, so there's some opportunities in all of these changes that we're also trying to identify. Over.
Yeah, thank you. Jeff, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, about how the environment is changing to operate on the ground. You know, and does that mean you adjust your strategy?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Certainly, and I think, you know, we have to talk about this against the backdrop of the advancements that have been made in both public and global health within China in the last, you know, number of years. Obviously, China was declared malaria-free last year in 2020. There continue to be advancements in TB in the public healthcare setting in China, expansion of HPV and other vaccines into the national immunization program, things like that. Obviously, coming on the heels of the Japanese encephalitis vaccine, which was given WHO PQ a number of years ago. So overall, China's role in global health is obviously going to expand. Now, it remains behind the U.S. in terms of R&D and innovation spend, but if you read the last 5-year plan, obviously there's an explicit focus on these areas moving forward. So what does that mean for us? What does the US-China competition mean? I think in terms of civil society in China, everyone's familiar with the FNGO law that was passed in 2017 that dictates how organizations like ours are managed. But even since then, certainly we've seen, as Steve referenced, an increasingly complex set of reporting and oversight requirements. To your specific question around strategy, I don't know that it has necessarily, as of yet, impacted what we look at from a strategic standpoint, but it has certainly impacted some of our operational requirements and the time and effort required to continue to be an NGO, especially a US-based NGO that's on the ground operating there. All of that said, the competition has also created opportunities that I think are more, as Steve referenced a little bit, on the strategic side, especially as China seeks to fill some of the void that's left by, you know, frankly, diminishing U.S. leadership in some places. So, so we see global health and development priorities showing up more regularly in speeches. There was a white paper last year entitled The China International Development Cooperation in the New Era in early 2021, which followed on the heels of the creation of CITCA, the Chinese International Development Global Development Organization. Now, that said, those commitments are often vague, and mid-level bureaucracy is sort of left to translate what that means in terms of direction and strategy. And that's where they will look for partnership from organizations like the Gates Foundation and other NGOs who have the know-how, who have the technical assistance, whether it's in vaccine and drug development or supporting WHO PQ, as Steve mentioned, modernization of the medical regulatory environment. That's really the role that we can play in help providing that technical assistance and help making the right connections to global organizations and global stakeholders. So that's really where the opportunity has started to show up as a result of this otherwise difficult strategic competition. I think the last thing I would say is overall, there's just a recognition that any NGO, and certainly foreign NGOs in China, we have to be smarter about how we talk about our work, both in the US and in China. We have to be extremely transparent, apolitical, obviously maintain our focus on supporting underserved populations globally, and I think we're fortunate, again, having some of the ability to operate with our size and reputation, and the reputation of our co-chairs. You know, we can navigate these issues effectively, but it's certainly you know, the space to operate within them is certainly tightening.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's also a growing role of soft power now in health. So I'm interested in asking all of you how the health industries in both countries are acting in the international arena, and how geopolitics may be impacting this. Maybe start with Steve.
Go off mute so you don't hear my dog. Yeah, one little sort of footnote to what Jeff was saying, I think it's applicable both for NGOs, but for frankly anybody in health working in country is and I think one of the biggest wrinkles we're going to have to work out, and like what does it mean for all of us and how do we navigate it, is the emerging data sharing laws, and that becomes particularly difficult when you're, I mean, we've been working very hard to get more data on what's going on in China around, the output of clinical trials for some of these vaccine developments and stuff. And it just adds, there's already a culture of opacity, but then you've got these new, very explicit laws about what can be shared. And as it applies to health research, it creates a lot of challenges. So we're gonna, that's definitely an area that, while there's been a chilling effect, there's also kind of a conscious discussion about this. Could we argue for some policy exceptions or something, but that's one. So yeah, no, the health arena is, as I mentioned, has become very, very political. I mean, it's just, I mean, I don't think you can do anything in China with China anymore that doesn't have a lot of political implications, and that's always been the case. But it's particularly so you've seen in COVID how not only have there been these sort of issues that have shown up in terms of, as Jennifer was saying, contrasting models of containment or lack thereof in the U.S. And those things have been a bit weaponized by both countries, and therefore, and both, both in terms of kind of endorsed and propaganda, but then there's been also misinformation. There's been a lot of deliberate misinformation about the effectiveness of certain kinds of vaccines and et cetera, and the safety, and those things have created a lot of, those are very political in nature. Some of that criticism, it's not scientific on both sides, and then in the work of again in COVID, the vaccine nationalism has played a huge role, not only obviously in terms of the gross inequity we see globally in who's received the vaccine, any kind of COVID vaccine, and who hasn't, and how the rich world has hoarded their vaccines, but there's a sort of semi-competition in a lot of lower middle income and lower income countries over the Chinese bilateral vaccine distribution, with less effective but more readily available in the early stages of the pandemic, at least, inactivated vaccines from Sinopharm and Sinovac. And then you have the more expensive, usually through a multilateral distribution mechanism called COVAX, which China has participated in, but only at a limited level. And that's really where, sort of on the ground, there's been quite a bit of, are we going to be forced to choose one versus the other? And most countries are trying to avoid that choice, and but it's still it's frankly, it's very random and somewhat crazy. I mean, like, why you see triple the amount of vaccines that are not going to be used in some countries in Africa versus having none in another country because of its strategic priority for and as a marketplace. So that's one of the many really tragedies in this of many, and it's very much related to this tension between the U.S. and China right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this topic is something you looked into quite a lot, Jennifer, in your research and work. So want to give you a chance to weigh in on this too.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of China's in general strategy on global health too. So we know that China's traditional global health effort is really sending out medical teams, right? So this is started back in the 60s. And it's usually province and country partners. But I think in early 2000, as China gradually from the international donor recipient change into a donor's role, we increasingly see China start to donate or sell medical products to Africa, Southeast Asia. So that's become one of their strategies, along with building the clinics, the humanitarian aids increase, as well as training and so on. But it backfired in early 2010-ish when they're trying to lead the anti-malaria drugs in Africa. And then they discovered that many of these drugs the quality is not good, or who knows, they're fake drugs. So the reputation got a hit. It's, one of the things that when we see global health as a soft power, there are, many risk factors associated with that. So, and traditionally, I think the vaccine is not a profit-driven business, right? So even though China is trying to get into the pharmaceutical the market globally, they still have to jump into these hoops of, because they have a developing country regulatory system. They have to redo their factories to meet certain standards. So all of that means you need more investment. And vaccine, I'm sure Steve and Jeff can comment on that. Gates Foundation helped tremendously for China to get the PQs for a couple of vaccine to be PQ'd by the WHO. But my sense from the ground, talking to pharmaceutical companies, they're not that interested in this. This is a small market, not a big profit, and government need to push on this. But I think COVID actually is a propeller on that. There's just tremendous progress given the needs for vaccine that has been taken in, I think, by the government. So I'll stop there, but I can, I'm sure Steve and Jeff can add.
Yeah,
The only thing I would add is that's absolutely true. And there's been sort of this historic in the vaccine industry there, and there's a big enough market, domestic market. There's a lot of hassle to get into the global market because of all these export rules and requirements. But I do think that's changing. The level of investment we've seen in the private vaccine marketplace in China in the last year has like tripled. And so I think we're seeing a real indicator that as quality gains, they're making gains on quality, as demand is understood differently, seeing the opportunity for high volume, low margin, but high volume, particularly if you can get public guarantees through some of these multilateral mechanisms, as an opportunity. And we're seeing more and more local Chinese, both big and small companies, come forward with a plan for thinking about developing and exporting their vaccines and drugs. So we hope that actually portends well for having not only more vaccines and drugs and medical supplies on the global market of quality. So we're we're all concerned about quality from regardless of where it's coming from, but also, frankly, on the vaccine side, the more Chinese vaccines can be qualified, it will create a pricing pressure against the Indians who supply almost all the global vaccines today in terms of the most of the vaccines for global distribution in Africa are actually manufactured in India. And so we think that that's actually, to have a more healthy global marketplace, that'll help us. So we're kind of, that's sort of a direction that I think will happen in the next decade.
Anything to add, Jeff?
I think the only thing I'll add, and it's just piggybacking a bit on both of the last couple of questions, one of the things that we've heard from stakeholders in Africa is that the competition between the US and China, some of the sort of more market-based competition that Steve just referred to, is actually now being seen as a benefit within Africa, because they're starting to develop the opportunity for choice, and they're starting, as opposed to just sort of taking whatever is provided from whatever country is willing to sort of step in and fill that void. So I think over the long term, you could actually see some outsized benefits based specifically on US and China competition.
So we know, to be realistic, there are limitations on what we can expect. What are some of the policies or issues that you think will continue to impact or limit ability for cooperation in certain areas of health? Some have mentioned the China initiative. Data transfer is certainly an issue. Jeff, what do you think are our biggest limitations?
Yeah, I mean, those are certainly big ones. I mean, I think that it's hard to overstate how significant the data piece could be. I'm sure Steve can speak more to that. but the fact is you eventually are going to run into issues with any sort of health related cooperation if you have bifurcated data systems, if you don't enable data sharing between academic partners, private sector partners, civil society, government, et cetera. So I think that's certainly important. I think the other one that we've talked about in, I think, previous sessions here with WCRC is the role of sanctions, civil military fusion sanctions, et cetera, that many companies, including those in the biotech space, have been or risk, I think, being included in, whether it's U.S. entity lists or whether it's retaliatory sanctions from Beijing, et cetera. This has impacted, frankly, academic institutions as well within China. And for an organization like ours that has a very broad network of partners, grantees, sub-grantees, it's particularly challenging to predict or to navigate, whether one of your partners will show up or be implicated in that at some point along the path. So that's, those are certainly the areas that I think we are most concerned about, yet simultaneously don't have a great deal of insight into how to predict where it goes.
Mm-hmm. Steve or Jennifer?
The only one I would add there on that sort of list on the risk side, and we should talk about the opportunity side as well, but is I think supply chain it continues to be a very big issue. I mean, obviously we're seeing constraints in supply chain, and there's a China story behind that, and that's a piece of this larger global market. But also sourcing and the source of sourcing, both using it as a political weapon is a potential, but also literally concerned about where this, like in other industries, we have it in health as well, which is, where did this come from? What's the quality? What do we know about the human rights conditions and others of where it's come from? So that has continued to peer around the corner too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if I can add a couple of things. The data issue already affecting the global network on research. I've personally heard the global disease registries now stopped to have China because the China partner was not clear, how this data law will be implemented. And there were cases that academia or physicians been interrogated or arrested due to their collaborations with the international network. So that's a big factor, and especially because now it's uncertain, so no one dare to, very few people is comfortable to do so. Everything is on pause now. The other thing is I feel that it's very difficult to find funding. The funding for collaborative research partly is, the results of the research can be politicized. So the funding agency are much more sensitive about this and doesn't want to have the results to be political side or used by political different sides, right? It's in the between. And third, I would say is some of even for conferences, I think during the COVID, even with all the travel bans, with Zoom or these virtual meetings, they were changing policies, especially coming from China. Sometimes we were told, overseas scholars cannot attend the meeting real time. It has to be recording, has to be screened. So I think all of these are new and maybe temporary, but right now it does add to that paranoia factor.
Thank you. Yeah, it's certainly a difficult time, but the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as some of you may know, in its report last month said there's no choice but to find some way for the US and China to work together because the health security of Americans depends on it. So what do you think are either the best areas for potential collaboration or some of the best ideas you've heard for improving the collaboration? And Steve, I know you're part of that advisory body, so perhaps you'd like to kick off.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was part of the CIS commission. I was a commissioner on the initial commission on national health security, which was weird because we reported it to Congress like in February of 2020 and saying, you know, there's a real national security threat going on here. And then this subsequent piece on China. So I actually do think that there are areas, as I was alluded to, that while there's these challenging pieces, that we'll see more opportunity for collaboration. You know, certainly on what we're calling, you know, kind of in the lingo of pandemic preparedness, there's a very high level of consciousness that it can't be done without both China and the US at the table from the global side. And there will have to be some very complicated routes in which we can share data, but I think there's a recognition that by both sides that's one of those sort of areas that we're going to have to collaborate on. And that is everything from, so one of the, you know, big asset we feel like we need to make sure we're working with closely with the Chinese government is what's the model for, you know, using anonymized data and other their technical ways to share on genomic sequencing and genomic surveillance as we look at the opportunity for next generation pathogens that could create a next pandemic, and how do we do that in a more globally unified way is certainly one. I also think another area where I think you'll see a lot of, it'll be sticky because of the tech being you know, so heavily restricted and managed, but there was some great innovation coming out of China on the use of you know, like the tracking tracing tool that Tencent did, you know, was very useful in India and other places, et cetera. So I think you'll see more places to say there's some best practices that we saw from Chinese, just, you know, pure, you know, sheer innovation that we could, you know, maybe find ways to, if not use in the United States, it might be necessary, but share globally. So I think we'll find some traction there. There's certainly a set of conversations around, for instance, you know, what's the best way to work together on travel and travel restrictions, not only coordinate better, but also even, you know, the secure vaccine certification work, et cetera. So we're not, you know, requiring people to use multiple systems and multiple, you know, respect common vaccine platforms. And that's a ways to go, but I've seen some real progress from my perch. I've been chairing the WHO's Commission on Digital Health, and I think we see some opportunity there. And so I feel like that report is a reflection of some of us that are saying, look, we got to be careful to separate the headlines from the trend lines. And the headlines are pretty ugly, and they actually tell a real story. I'm not denying that story, but you know, beneath the headlines, there are numerous exceptions to the rules where there's enough common interests that we've been able to have, you know, particularly with mid-level bureaucrats, to say, can we create a safe space to have this conversation on both sides, and not be worried about respecting governments because it's too important for the world. And I think we're seeing some of that.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer and Jeff, what are your ideas here?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would like to add, I think two points. One is multilateral. I think earlier in the chat, Raymond talked about what about the medical center to the Chinese medical center. I know people at Mount Sinai and in California, some of the groups has always been fostering these collaborations, start very early on when the COVID cases, clinical cases were mostly in China. So I think that type of a connection is still there. And I think that's a good angle. Cooperation to cooperation, Christy, as you mentioned, are still going on. So I agree with that. The second part, I thought, you know, even if there's no direct US-China policy or research network, it can still be a global or regional network. And personally, you know, by looking at China's surveillance system, they have a very good, you know, at least hardware and lots of investment in the influenza surveillance as well as the pneumonia surveillance system. And COVID has shown that the influenza system work much better than, more sensitive than pneumonia, because the influenza system is supported not just by China's government, but also the WHO, the regional offices. So I think, I'm sure our Chinese colleagues are aware of that even if there's, regional network and regional training center, that will help keep those surveillance system sustained and keep in the good shape. So, and I think Robert mentioned APAC. I definitely see that Asian Regional Center for Global Health and Health studies will be a good strong area. I know there was Guangdong. I worked with the Guangdong CDC for a while. They have top-notch pandemic preparedness, better than some other provinces probably. And they work with Hong Kong, Macau routinely. So they have a small, group there. But I see, that type of model can be expanded. Then I think that will still bring China into the international loop. Yeah.
Yeah, I would only add, just to underscore Jennifer's point, RE multilateral collaboration. That is something that we certainly see as an important factor, but also recognizing that it will be very important as the broader we try to bring China along that journey into the multilateral space, that they have their own ideas, their own incentives, et cetera, that we will need to navigate in terms of helping them, and that it's not necessarily a matter of will. Certainly, China wants to increase its contributions via both multilateral and bilateral channels, but it's also a matter of helping them understand how and what are the best mechanisms to do that. And that's, going back to the point that we made earlier about the role that the civil society can play, being a technical assistance provider, helping with that expertise, bringing them along in that journey when there are questions, when there's strategic directional sort of issues to sort through, to align with the incentives that they have already set for themselves. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Certainly some great ideas. I want to make sure we have time for the audience questions. So I think they've been gathering in the chat room. Nor, I'll turn it over to you to read those out.
Well, sure, but actually, the panelists have been doing quite a good job of picking them up as we go along. Jennifer, in particular, has answered a number of the questions. So I think one that has not been answered, again, a Bob Cap question, is do we see any particular champions in China's political or bureaucratic upper levels who might try and sustain and support U.S.-China cooperation in health? Anybody have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, without naming names, there are people that are very concerned about the direction this is going. And we know from some of the conversations we've had with people and in various ministries, Ministry of Health, but also Ministry of Foreign Affairs and NDRC and others, that there is a concern that, COVID has taught a lot of lessons, and there's a concern that it may have turned less from a political victory to somewhat of a political embarrassment, and therefore that has given some energy to go and fix some of these problems. And there's also, but one of the things we're quite concerned about, I wouldn't say concerned, but everybody's watching, is, about a third of the bureaucracy is expected to shift over the next 12 to 24 months. And so a lot of these people are, and particularly the people that have been very supportive of the collaborations in the past are not going to be as visible or have the authority they've had. And so that it'll be interesting to see, although we're starting to get kind of a read on who this next level, this next cohort. And I think that, again, there's a commitment that is reflected in Xi's writings and statements about, about committing to have China have more global public goods on the market, and know that to do that, there's got to be more global cooperation. I think that there are people in the central government at very senior levels recognizing that just giving China free rein to dump products into Africa didn't work. Like Jennifer, it won't work again. The environment has changed dramatically. No one can do that anymore. The US, no one can. You've got to work with local governments. You've got to work through multilateral mechanisms, et cetera, to be more effective. And knowing that, I think that there's a group of people that are supporting that.
Great. Back on that vaccine question, particularly with Africa. There was a question that came in the box earlier, and Jennifer addressed it to some degree. But do you see, is there an effort on the part of the Chinese government to support the development of vaccines for lesser known, or we might say non-commercial diseases, particularly in Africa, tropical Africa? Do you see any?
Not very much. I think Jennifer stated that, the vaccine industry has been pretty insular. It's been mainly covering, the key domestic diseases that are regulated through their EPI, their vaccine required vaccines. It's only recently that we're seeing some research in non-communicable diseases, like, in neglected tropical diseases that we care a lot about. Not only, I think Jeff mentioned Japanese encephalitis was really a breakthrough opportunity for the global markets, but now we're seeing, advanced work on some various, early stage work on some other diseases. A couple of things. One is China is really doubling down right now on getting their mRNA vaccine capacity built out, and it's early, but we imagine that will have a very dramatic effect on global vaccine supply. The second is, one of the things that we're doing, and not just on the vaccine side, but on the therapeutic side, is investing in areas it's the argument I've made to Bill is like, if you could just take, if we could just create mechanisms or convince from a policy statement matter, like 1% of the global medical R&D going to global, global health diseases that we care about, it would be more than, Europe is doing all combined. And so, we've actually invested heavily in a drug discovery group with Tsinghua, and that's very much the goal of that is to, redirect a little bit of attention or catalyze it on things like TB and HIV and malaria and other things.
Anyone else on that? Yeah. Jennifer?
It's a little bit off that topic specific. I think that Steve did a great job of wrapping that up. But my thought is it relates to that, and especially relates to China's global health assistance programs overseas. I think China has done quite a lot, experiment quite a lot, and also learned quite a lot. But I think that's a very typical China's strategy. But I wish sometimes, we could have a systematic review or understanding of how soft power and global health associated to each other. Recently the Korean government, the foundation was asking RAND to support them on analyze, South Korea was very successful on COVID response, but whether that success can be translated into good public policy and good collaboration. And we learned quite a lot from that exercise. So I think, that type of exercise can help to avoid some of these, because we all think that health is should be a good area that less political, but to get there, we need a little bit more work. Yeah.
And it can even be, fairly tactical. I mean, one of the interesting conversations recently, just in the last 6 months, given what US has done in Afghanistan, is we're in the very, very last stretch of eradicating polio. Afghanistan and Pakistan are the two remaining countries where we have polio virus still showing up, very few cases. We think we're close to the finish line, but now China actually might have better access to some of those communities than the US does anymore. So those are the kind of sort of very practical conversations we need to have, and we are having with the right people. That's pretty less, it's not very politicized, which is nice.
And earlier you talked about, not government to government, but private collaboration that's going on. And Mark Wen, who's involved in the industry, asked the question. Mark was quoted recently in an article about, I think it's Brigham and Women's from Boston that they had basically a failed project in China. So his question is, do you see still cooperation going on, maybe on the commercial side, with these hospital projects or other investments between US and China in the healthcare space?
Well, I'll take a crack at it, and I see Bob's comment as well about university viable. I mean, I think those those kind of collaborations from, I'm not an expert on it, so I want to be really clear, like I haven't studied it, but my understanding is those are where the hit has been taken. And it's a combination of things. I mean, it's not just the policy environment and but the travel bans, have also really complicated it. The China initiative, the ripple effect of that, the 2 Michaels in Canada. I mean, you just have all these ripple effects that have sort of put a pretty big damper on some of those collaborations. But then I was talking to folks over at the UW, and there's still some really fascinating and important collaborations. We have the GXI here in Seattle that is still, I mean, and if anything, it's picked up some steam in the last year. So I still feel like nothing's withered completely to be, but that's where the hiccup feels to be the most profound in my view. But that's my view only.
Yeah, and just to add to your point about not about the healthcare sector, but in other U.S. businesses in China, they had record FDI, record foreign direct investment in China this year. So U.S. businesses on the ground in China are doing quite well these days. So
yeah, somebody said to me the other day, the business community didn't get this memo. Like something was going wrong.
Yeah, exactly right. But that's another good point. I mean, we hear about China has an advantage over the U.S. because they can have these huge data sets, and they can run trials on a much wider scale than the US can. I think maybe privacy comes into that too. Is that an issue that the US healthcare industry needs to be concerned about, or is it puts it at a strategic disadvantage vis-a-vis China?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I don't want to take a hog. I think it's both. I mean, I think it's implicitly an advantage. I mean, the speed to which you can get the trials done, but I think it's a huge issue for industry, because ultimately it gets back to kind of the supply chain question. Like at some point you don't want to be the New York Times story either, that and I think the US companies are aware of that. No, and there's more and more, kind of regulatory review common regulatory review of these protocols. So, but we've seen it in the, I mean, I do a lot in the digital health field, and we see it that, the ability, one of the reasons I referenced the Tencent tracking and tracing app is that it had, over 1 billion users data it was, working with in terms of its every day. And so it had such an extraordinary amount of data that it could actually translate into understanding human movement and human behavior in a way that was less about oppressive, surveillance systems of a authoritarian regime. That's just like sheer the math of AI, that the bigger the end, the more effective the outputs.
Yeah, the story that a lot of people have been following recently is this migrant worker in Beijing who showed what a difficult life he had, and that was all exposed because of the app. Could say exactly where he was for days on end, etc. And people got to see that. Okay, we're coming near the end of the session. Do we dare take a crack at how China is going to get itself out of the COVID issue? Someone, do we want to talk about that? I mean, it's
my wild guess here.
Okay, please go ahead.
My wild guess is like if using the China model, it will be opening on a small island first to have the international flights in, and maybe adding the vaccine or other treatment targeting the high risk groups, and if that's successful, it will be expand to others. That's my guess.
So we should all start booking. If we want to go back to China, we should start booking flights to Hainan. Hainan Airlines should return to Seattle soon.
Portal. I think that's, I mean, I think they're going to take our estimation right now is they're going to take a fairly prudent, very safe, very cautious. They're still unwilling to do heterogeneous vaccine. I mean, you still can't take a booster of a different vaccine, which would be, from a Western scientific perspective, or even any epidemiologist say seems to be working. If you could put an mRNA booster on top of a inactivated vaccine, but that's not happening yet in China from a policy level. But I think I think there'll be some, caution. I think the only thing is if there was evidence of major surges in the next month, then it's going to be very, very different outcome. Then, I mean, it'd be very hard to do a cautious approach then.
Yeah, and of course, those of us in the region that thrive on having Chinese visitors, I guess we can 2024 before we can probably see when that happens.
Yeah, we keep saying, I mean, 2022 is not going to be a year of a lot of activity. I mean, between obviously the party Congress, between the Olympics, between the US midterms, there's just I mean, if there's a thaw or there's really new opportunity, unless something weird breaks or, something on externality happens, we don't think anything will really have any consequential policy will change until 2023.
Thank you. Christy, do you want to step back in for a moment?
Sure. Well, I think it's been a great discussion. Really appreciate all of the insights from the panelists. And thank you so much for your time, for being here. Thank you to the audience as well for participating in this discussion and all your great questions. I will just say, have a great new year. Please stay healthy and stay in touch.
And I'll conclude by echoing Christy's comments. A really good session, a lot of interesting points brought up, and I'm sure we could continue the discussion sometime in the future. I'd like to mention those of you that follow us, our next session is on February 24th, and we're going to have Representative Adam Smith, who represents Washington's 9th District, and who's also the chairman of the Armed Forces Services Committee. He's going to be with us to chat about US-China relations. So please join us if you can for that date. So again, thanks to the audience, and very great, thanks very much, particularly to the panelists and our moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.